Hi everyone, and welcome to part two of the Hume reading. So just a very quick reminder of where we finished up, or I guess the main point of the first section of the reading. Hume presented the argument that the self, or the concept of self, or identity, is something that is believed to exist across an extended period of time, for example, across the lifespan. He presents the idea that no impression um, exists across life, and that there's no evidence for anything outside of impressions, and so therefore the self uh, does not exist, at least as something that exists across the lifespan. For Hume, remember, if there's no evidence for something, then we can't say that it exists, no matter how troubling that conclusion might be, even the idea that the self does not exist. So in part two, what we're going to see is a bit of a focus on the way that we perceive identity and the way that we perceive personal identity. And it's going to focus on the idea of change. What Hume is going to point out is that anytime something changes, well, we can't say that it is the same as what it was before. These are not now the same thing, and we would be incorrect if we said that they were the same thing. This is fine for something like something large. So, for example, an amputee is probably not a bad example in that if they end up having a leg cut off for whatever reason, I mean, that's a significant change, and it would be fair to say that that person would change significantly before their leg was removed and after. And we would not identify them as being the same as they were before. What we're more troubled by is the smaller or the gradual change. So, is it really that different to have a leg removed to, say, have hair fall out of your head, even just one? Is this not a change? Does this not mean that you are now, at least physically, not the same as you were before? And if that's the case, well, then does such a thing as continuous identity or a continuous self even exist? So you can see here that it's quite an extreme view, but it's hard to argue against. If we think that a physical change is enough to determine that someone has changed, then why is it only for large physical changes? And Hume presents a problem with it in that, well, at what proportion? At one point, he starts talking about proportions. At what proportion of change does the person actually change? So that's what this reading is going to focus on. Let's get straight into it. So we're going from where we left off. At the bottom right-hand side of the page, you should see a number 301, and we're going about halfway down the page with the paragraph that starts, "What then gives us so great?" Okay, so here we go. "What then gives us so great a propension to ascribe an identity to these successive perceptions, and to suppose ourselves possessed of an invariable and uninterrupted existence through the whole course of our lives?" So here Hume is still talking about what we were discussing in the first video, this idea of a continued idea of self. In order to answer this question, we must distinguish betwixt personal identity as regards our thoughts and imagination, and as it regards our passions or the concern we take in ourselves. So sort of splitting identity up here. The first is our present subject, and to explain it perfectly, we must take the matter pretty deep, and account for that identity which we attribute to plants and animals, there being a great analogy betwixt it and the identity of a self or person. We have a distinct idea of an object that remains invariable and uninterrupted through a supposed variation of time, and this idea we call that of identity or sameness. So Hume's going to use these terms a little bit, identity and sameness. So just to go back for a moment to the start of this paragraph, we have a distinct idea of an object that remains invariable and uninterrupted through a supposed variation of time. And this idea we call that of identity or sameness. So he's defining identity or sameness as something that exists across an extended period of time, but which we identify as being uninterrupted or invariable. In other words, something that hasn't really changed. We have also a distinct idea of several different objects existing in succession and connected to each other by a close relation. And this, to an accurate view, affords as perfect a notion of diversity as if there were no manner of relation among the objects. So here Hume's using it, defining a different word, and that is diversity. And he's saying that these are things that are very closely linked to each other but are not the same. A great, the image that always comes into my head is that of dominoes. One is very closely linked to the next, to the next, to the next, but they're not the same. They're not one thing. It's just that one leads to the next, leads to the next. So they are linked together. But this is what Hume is referring to as diversity. It's important to note that it's not an old wooden ship used during the Civil War era. And 10 points to whoever gets that reference. But though these two ideas of identity and a succession of related objects be in themselves perfectly distinct and even contrary, yet 'tis certain that in our common way of thinking they are generally confounded with each other. So Hume here has pointed out that, okay, we've got on the one hand sameness and identity, and then on the other hand diversity. And these are supposed to be two absolutely opposed objects. Okay. Identity and sameness is something that is invariable, whereas diversity is something that's very variable. It changes a lot. It's diverse. Okay. So they shouldn't be able to be the same thing. And yet, what Hume is going to point out is that we're quite often confused between the two. And we think that we're looking at sameness and identity when actually we're looking at what, well, Hume is going to argue at least, we're looking at diversity. That action of the imagination by which we consider the uninterrupted and invariable object, and that by which we reflect on the succession of related objects, are almost the same to the feeling, nor is there much more effort of thought required in the latter case than in the former. So what Hume is starting to talk about here is the fact that when you know, when we've got succession of objects, in other words, this is like the domino analogy I was talking about, it feels very natural to think that they're one thing. Okay, watching a movie, at least one shown on an old film projector, is another good example of this. It feels like it's one knitted together story, but actually, when you look at the film stock, it's individual pictures. It's one picture and then another and then another and then another. Okay, and as it's run in front of the light, those pictures net together into what we perceive to be one thing. Okay, but it's not. It's actually a succession of lots of different things. So Hume is starting to introduce this idea that what we perceive to be sameness or identity is actually diversity. A movie is not a movie. It's actually a diverse number of pictures that are presented together in a succession that makes you feel like they are the same. Apparently, I have two new albums. All right, continuing on. Um, The relation facilitates the transition of the mind from one object to another and renders its passage as smooth as if it were as if it contemplated one continued object. So at no point when you're watching a movie is your mind going, okay, there's one image, one image, one image, one image. No, your mind knits it together for you in this seamless way to make you feel like you're experiencing one thing, okay, a sameness. This is, what our mind is there to do. It helps us to understand and operate in the world that we're in. But it is a mistake. This resemblance is the cause of the confusion and mistake and makes us substitute the notion of identity instead of that of related objects. However, at one instant, we may consider the related succession as variable or interrupted as, interrupted. We are sure the next to ascribe to it a perfect identity and regard it as invariable and uninterrupted. Our propensity to this mistake is so great that for the resemblance above mentioned, that we fall into it before we are aware, and though we incessantly correct ourselves by reflection and return to a more accurate method of thinking, yet we cannot long sustain our philosophy or take off this bias from the imagination. Hume is saying here that our mind is so well programmed to knit this stuff together for us. Okay, to combine everything that we're seeing into one seamless notion, that we very quickly, as soon as we're not really thinking about it, as soon as we relax in our attitude, then what ends up happening is that we forget that we're looking at lots of individual things. We forget that these are separate parts. Okay, and so this is uh, this is a difficult thing to get by, um, because as soon as you stop like thinking about this, then your mind is very quickly going to go back to its old habit of linking things together in a sameness and giving it an identity, when actually what you're looking at is a lot of different objects just presented one after each other, like a movie. Okay. Our last resource is to yield to it and boldly assert that these different related objects are in effect the same, however interrupted and variable. In order to justify to ourselves this absurdity, we often feign some new and unintelligible principle that connects the objects together and prevents their interruption or variation. So just to pause here for a moment. So if you haven't made the link yet, what Hume is really saying, because remember, this is about personal identity, what Hume is really saying is that there's no such thing as personal identity, because every second of every day you are changing. You are never the same as you were a moment ago. Like I said at the start of the video, one hair might fall out of your head. That is a change. And just like the image number one on the film reel and image number two are not the same, you with that hair and you without that hair are now no longer the same. It might feel like you are the same. But remember, Hume is saying this is because our mind is so good at knitting our world together that it very easily makes you believe that. What Hume is pointing out here is that this is very troubling for people, and that it doesn't sit very well, this idea that there is really no you. There is you at any instant, but that's it. There's no continued identity of you. Um, and so the last resort, Hume says, is that people agree with this argument that, yeah, we're changing all the time. However, there is one thing that is unchangeable. Okay. And this is where we get, whatever we want to call it, the soul or the mind. Hume's going to talk about soul, self, substance as different ideas that it's been presented as. But for Hume, this is kind of the last resort of the desperate man trying to figure out something that is unchangeable when actually the answer is simple. There is nothing that is unchangeable. All right, so he says, thus we feign the continued existence of the perceptions of our senses to remove the interruption and run into the notion of a soul and self and substance to disguise the variation. So this is the thing that we create to make us feel like there is a continued self. But we may further observe that whether we do not give rise, that where we do not give rise to such a fiction, our propension to confound identity with relation is so great that we are apt to imagine something unknown and mysterious connecting the parts, beside their relation. And this I take to be the case with regard to the identity we ascribe to plants and vegetables. So don't worry too much about the plants and vegetable stuff. What Hume has said here is that when we accept that we are constantly physically changing, the only way that you can really justify a form of identity, at least lasting identity, is with some sort of mystical element. Okay, we create the soul and we say that is the true us, that's the true self. It is unchanging. Remember, Plato sort of argued this, that the soul is perfect and unchanging. Um, for Hume, well, where's your evidence? Not a lot. So And even when this does not take place, we still feel a propensity to confound these ideas, though we are not able fully to satisfy ourselves in that particular, nor find anything invariable and uninterrupted to justify our notion of identity. So here Hume is saying even people who disagree with the existence of the soul still have this feeling like they are one continuous thing, even though they have no justification for it whatsoever. It is like our natural instinct to think that we are one thing, that we have a personal identity. Thus, the controversy concerning identity is not merely a dispute of words, for when we attribute identity in an improper sense to variable or interrupted objects, our mistake is not confined to the expression, but is commonly attended with a fiction either of something invariable and uninterrupted, or of something mysterious and inexplicable, or at least with some propensity to such fiction. So what Hume is saying here is, this isn't just a matter of like academic debate. We're not just arguing here about the meaning of words. What does it mean when I use the word identity? Hume is saying it's more powerful than that because when people argue that there is personal identity, when you scratch the surface of that, what they're actually arguing for is the existence of some sort of mystical element, some thing that doesn't have any evidence for it whatsoever existing, to justify that they exist over a period of time. And for Hume, that's just not good enough. Um, if there's no evidence, we shouldn't believe it. What will suffice to prove this hypothesis to the satisfaction of every fair inquirer is to show from daily experience and observation that the objects which are variable or interrupted, and yet are supposed to continue the same, are such only as consist of a succession of parts connected together by resemblance, contiguity, or causation. So in other words, what he's going to do is talk about a few different things and say, this looks like it's one thing, but actually it's lots of different things that appear to be one thing because of this succession of parts connected together by resemblance, contiguity, or causation. Okay, like the film reel or the dominoes. For as such, a succession answers evidently to our notion of diversity. It can only be by mistake we ascribe to it an identity, and as the relation of parts, which leads us into this mistake, is really nothing but a quality, what produces an association of ideas and an easy transition of the imagination from one to another, it can only be from the resemblance which this act of the mind bears to that, by which we contemplate one continued object, that the error arises. So what Hume is saying here is that I'll show you these things that change one after each other. You're naturally going to say they are one thing, but what that is it's actually a mistake of your mind, because when you look at it critically, you'll see they're not one thing. They change. They are diverse. They are the definition of diversity. You feel like they are one thing, or at least that they should be one thing, because your mind wants to understand the world that way. And that's fine. Hume's not arguing here that we should be reprogramming our mind. What he's saying here is that we should stop saying that we know the identity of things, that things are the same when actually they're different. Um, we wouldn't call an odd number even. So why do we call something that's different the same? This is Hume's issue. Our chief business must then Our chief business then must be to prove that all objects to which we ascribe identity, without observing their invariableness and uninterruptedness, are such as consist of a succession of related objects. So that last sentence there really sums up what he's been talking about so far. So it's probably a good one to highlight. Um, in order to this, suppose any mass of matter of which the parts are contiguous and connected, or continuous and connected, to be placed before us. 'Tis plain we must attribute a perfect identity to this mass, provided all the parts continue uninterruptedly and invariably the same, whenever motion or change of place, whatever motion or change of place we may observe, either in the whole or in any of the parts. So what Hume's saying here is, imagine something physical sitting in front of you. Your body, for example. Your body, a physical object sitting in front of you. We identify this as one, as having an identity. But let's continue with Hume. But suppose some very small or inconsiderable part to be added to the mass or subjected from it. Though this absolutely destroys the identity of the whole, strictly speaking, yet as we seldom think so accurately, we scruple not to pronounce a mass of matter the same where we find so trivial an alteration. So you're sitting here listening to this video, the physical body. One hair falls out of your head. Okay, one tiny little, almost inconceivable, or as Hume says here, trivial change. When you see this hair float down off your head, you're probably not sitting there going, "Oh my God, I have fundamentally changed. My identity is now different." No, your mind goes, "Oh, a hair has fallen out of my head, but I am still the same." Okay, that hair was not me, wasn't it? Weren't you existing with a certain number of hairs in your head at that period of time? And if that hair has fallen out, do you not have one less hair in your head now? Doesn't that make you different? Okay, if I was to give a perfect definition, think of me defining your physical self absolutely perfectly, right down to the molecule. Could I write the exact same definition for your physical self after the hair has fallen out? Of course not. The answer has to be no. And so, even though this is a trivial change, our mind very easily goes with it's just one hair, it doesn't really matter attitude. For Hume, well, that's not good enough. You're different than you were before. Okay, so identity has not uh, gone across this losing your hair. Okay, the passage of the thought from the object before the change to the object after it is so smooth and easy that we scarcely perceive the transition, and are apt to imagine that 'tis nothing but a continued survey of the same object. So because this change is so small, it doesn't feel like we've changed a lot. And to go back to the film reel analogy that I was using before, I think it fits very well with this. You know, if you've ever seen a film reel running slowly, it is very like it's stop start. You know, it's one image and then another and then another. And then as the projector warms up and starts moving, it all starts knitting together into one thing. And we're like, okay, it's not separate things anymore. It's just one. No, it's just as separated as the first images you saw. It's happening so much faster and so much more smoothly now that it feels as one. Okay. That transition from one object to the next, one picture to the next, is so smooth now that it just feels normal. It feels like it's one thing. There is a very remarkable circumstance that attends this experiment, which is that though the change of any considerable part in a mass of matter destroys the identity of the whole, yet we must measure the greatness of the part not absolutely, but by its proportion to the whole. So what Hume is saying here is, um, uh, if I remove a big enough part of you, then you'll say that you've changed. So again, going back to the start of the video, where he was talking about losing a hair off your head. Now I'm talking about taking a leg, okay, an entire leg. Have you changed now? Damn sure you've changed. But for Hume, that change is not all that different. It's just more molecules have been removed, okay? In other words, a larger portion of the whole has been removed. At what point do we say that, okay, at this number of molecules, you have now changed. Okay, if X number of molecules gets removed, we're going to consider that a change. But X minus one, no, that's fine. That's not a change. Well, this sounds silly. Surely it's either one molecule or no molecules. Okay, any even slight change surely has to be the same as even a large change. Diversity is diversity. Okay, the addition or diminution of a mountain would not be sufficient to produce a diversity in a planet, though the change of a very few inches would be able to destroy the identity of some bodies. So what he's just talking about this idea of proportion, and if the change is a big enough proportion, then we attribute it. It will be impossible to account for this but by reflecting that objects operate upon the mind and break or interrupt the continuity of its actions, not according to their real greatness, but according to their proportion to each other. This is an important little section here. So, and therefore, conclusion here, therefore, since this interruption makes an object cease to appear the same, it must be the uninterrupted progress of the thought which constitutes the imperfect identity. So what he's saying here is that if it's clear that the object has changed, but you're still perceiving sameness, then it's your thoughts that are making the sameness. Okay, the sameness does not actually exist in the object. If you're perceiving it to still be the same, even though the object itself has changed, then it's your perception that's creating sameness. In other words, sameness doesn't really exist. It's just something your mind is creating. This may be confirmed by another phenomenon. A change in any considerable part of a body destroys its identity, but 'tis remarkable that when the change is produced gradually and insensibly, we are less apt to ascribe to it the same effect. So even if we were to change someone drastically, as long as that drastic change happened very slowly, we'd still perceive them to be the same. Sound weird? Aging. Hume here, he's talking about aging. We perceive someone to be the same despite the fact that they have changed significantly. I mean, think of a 10-year-old versus a 20-year-old. That's significant change. They're literally taking a different physical space in the world because of growth. Why do we consider them to be the same? Because the change has happened so gradually, okay? That it's easy to forget that they've actually been changing. It's gradual and insensible, as Hume points out here. Okay, so but 'tis remarkable that where the change is produced gradually and insensibly, we are less apt to ascribe it to the same effect. The reason can plainly be no other than that the mind, in following the successive changes of the body, feels an easy passage from the surveying its condition in one moment to the viewing of it in another, and at no particular time perceives any interruption in its actions, from which continued perception it ascribes a continued existence and identity to the object. So again, sort of repeating what I've said before, but Hume here is saying that it is your mind that's creating the notion of personal identity. Okay, it's not physically in you. Your body changes constantly. There is no such thing as a self. There's no such thing as you. You are constantly changing. You feel like you do have a perception of self, but this is purely a mistake of the mind. There is no evidence to support it whatsoever. Okay, so hopefully that's been clear enough. There's probably about 2 more recordings left for Hume, I'd say, looking at the next section. So I'll try and get them done as soon as I can, and I'll see you soon. Like and subscribe as always. Diversity, an old wooden ship used during the Civil War era. Look it up.